Engage for Success Radio, raising the profile of employee engagement and shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.
Well, hello, and welcome to Engage for Success Radio, show number 584. Today's topic is going to be looking at equity as the foundation for a thriving workplace. But before we get into that, a little bit about Engage for Success and who I am. I'm Jo Moffat. I'm one of the regular hosts, and I'm a founder of Woodreed, a specialist agency where we help our clients create great places to work, high performing cultures of engaged employees. So all things employee engagement, employee experience, and of course, internal communication. And as one of the regular hosts of Engage for Success Radio, like everyone else involved in the movement, I'm a volunteer. So for those of you who are not all that familiar with who Engage for Success are, we are a not-for-profit movement. We are entirely supported by volunteers in terms of their time and expertise and enthusiasm. And Engage for Success is the UK's leading voice on the topic of employee engagement. We're setting out to raise awareness and running events through our area networks around the country and our topic and sector specific thought and action groups, developing research, publishing case studies, running online, virtual and in-person events, and shining a light on great practice. Do visit us at engageforsuccess.org, where you can learn more and sign up for our weekly newsletter. So today's show, 584 in our weekly series, Equity as the Foundation for a Thriving Workplace, where we're going to be talking about how factors like race, gender, neurodiversity, and socioeconomic background shape engagement. I think it's really important when we talk about equity to realise and remember that this is a broad church and there are a whole raft of factors that contribute to a diverse workplace. This show is now streaming live on YouTube. Just search Engage for Success Radio podcast, and you will be able to listen to me for the next half hour in conversation with this week's guest, who is Aang Lakey. Aang is a speaker, coach, and advocate. She is very much the specialist when it comes to integrating leadership, equity, and consciousness to advance social change. They have a background in social work, violence prevention, and organisational development. And Aang equips leaders with the tools to navigate challenges and, importantly, foster equitable, collaborative environments. So please welcome Aang. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really, really excited to be here and to talk with you today about equity in the workplace.
Thank you. Well, we're very excited to have you too, and it is such an important time for this whole concept. I think we touched on it before we came on air, and maybe we'll get a little bit of time towards the end of the show to sort of go back to that particular current situation in a little bit more. But before we begin, I think it's probably always a good idea to start with just asking you to share a couple of minutes of your background. What's brought you to be so interested and focused and to specialize in this particular area, Aang?
Yeah, of course. And so, I mean, I started out as a social worker. I was young and passionate about the work that I was doing, which at the time was sexual and domestic violence work.
Mm-hmm.
And I was working every day with survivors of trauma. And it was emotionally taxing for me. And so much of my time was taken up by my own mental chatter about how do I prevent this from happening? Because every day I was seeing that impact on individuals and how much it disrupted their life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really wanted to make a difference in that realm. And so as I started to explore that a little bit, I started to understand kind of the intersection of violence and things like diversity and inclusion,
Mm-hmm.
things like social constructionism and how we kind of create the world around us. And then also how things like emotional and social intelligence are tied to our ability to understand kind of some of these more broad concepts like diversity and inclusion and how that relates to violence prevention. And so as I just dug deeper and deeper, I transitioned my career a few times, moving from actually working with survivors to
Hmm.
doing violence prevention work. And then from there, I transitioned into doing diversity and inclusion work, trying to again prevent that violence from happening. And then, yeah, I started advising leaders on how to actually prevent violence in their organization, and starting with some of these concepts that we'll talk about today in terms of equity. And yeah, from there, the most important thing that I learned from working with leaders was that many leaders don't have the skill sets to be able to navigate their own unconscious bias and or understand how other people's socialization is impacting their workplace. And today we live in a global environment, and you're not going to find any country in the world where you're not going to have uh, people from different backgrounds, from different educational statuses, from different socioeconomic classes,
Mm.
and non-binary or queer people all kind of interacting in the same space. And so personally, I believe that the best way to help organizations and teams is to start with teaching the leaders. And so that's kind of how I ended up where I am
Where
today.
you got
I
to, yeah,
Yeah.
where you got to where you are. Lovely.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really useful. And interestingly, actually, I was on a webinar earlier today with an organisation, another not-for-profit actually, called Working Families, who are in the UK trying to promote the importance of family-friendly workplaces,
Yes.
and they have just launched a certification program for organisations to sign up for creating family-friendly workplaces, and there's a whole raft of sort of self-assessment and questionnaire that an organisation will go through. And I was really interested to see, and it just made me think of it as you were talking. One of the things that they look at is the extent to which an organisation has any kind of policies or guidelines around domestic violence and abuse.
Hmm.
And it was, to me, that hadn't really ever occurred to me before. When it comes to being a family friendly workplace, I tended to think of it as being around flexible working and paid paternity and maternity leave and those sorts of things. But it was actually much broader, and it included menopausal support, menstrual health, domestic violence and abuse, and so a much broader range of
Yes.
activities. So listening to what you've just been saying about your background, yeah, there's a real breadth to it, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad to hear that companies out there are starting to integrate this. And I'll just share very briefly, survivors of trauma, whether it's sexual or domestic violence, that impacts their workday all day, every day. And I can't
Mm,
even tell you the number of individuals that I sat with who would share with me, I cannot do anything at work without worrying about some of these areas that is my partner going to call me and like ask me where I am again in the middle of a meeting? Am I going to have to worry about where my money is going to go, and like all of these different things that kind of come into survivors
yes.
minds, and that impacts them because they can't let that go in the workplace. And so to not have some sort of either policies or programs to support individuals who are in those circumstances is, I think, doing a disservice to everyone.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So let's begin. Thank you for that introduction, Ang. Let's begin. It's always useful to just to define our terms, I think.
Mhm,
And there's an awful lot of acronyms. Is it EDI? Is it DEI? But we're talking about equity here,
mhm.
and I think that's a powerful word in itself. So what do we mean by that? Can you give us a little bit of a working definition for the next that will kind of underpin our discussions for the next 20 minutes or so?
Yeah, of course. And so I'm a really big believer in using the term equity instead of the term equality. And I'll just start by saying that equity to me recognizes that everyone on our team, it starts from different positions or different locations based on their systemic and structural backgrounds. And so where
Hmm.
they grew up, what languages they spoke, what kinds of schools they went to, how much money they had access to, whether or not they had housing and electricity and those kinds of things. And so if we have an organization that is just practicing equality and they're saying, we're going to give every single person the exact same thing, then they're missing that. If we go back to that domestic violence survivor example, they're missing the opportunity to connect with, even if it is just a small portion of individuals in their organization, they're missing the opportunity to connect with that person or those people and to give them exactly what they need, which of course is going to impact their working dynamic, because I personally believe in like a systems approach, and if one cog in that wheel is not functioning, then it's going to disrupt the rest of that mechanism. And so to me, equity is just about recognizing that everyone is in different places and it needs different access and support. And so when I think about that, I just think about, how do we provide services and information to individuals that is going to meet them where they're at. And as an example, if we give every single person a $500 bonus a year, and every single person has a different financial background, that $500 might go much farther to someone who is like, oh, I have all of my basic needs taken care of, therefore I'm going to invest this money and I'll get a return on it, versus someone who doesn't have enough money to feed their family. It might have to go towards their housing expenses or their food expenses or something along those lines. And
Yeah.
so having a more equitable approach would recognize that um, different individuals need different amounts of money.
And do you think, from the work that you do with organisations and in your sort of speaking and coaching activities, do people really understand equity and equality and the difference between them, or do people tend to use the words interchangeably and therefore incorrectly?
Yes. One of the reasons why I do always like to talk about them separately is because I have noticed, and I've worked, primarily in the government and the defense sectors, that they do use the words interchangeably, and there's not a recognition of the difference. And
Hmm.
so that's why I do try really hard to help leaders understand specifically what is equity and how is it different from equality. And I was in the Army for close to 16 years, and we always would hear, we all bleed red,
Yes,
and
yes.
the reality is we might all bleed red, but we all have different wounds.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, good analogy, absolutely. And so obviously there's a learning job to be done, or an educational job to be done to make sure people understand the difference between the two, and and it's not just a matter of using them interchangeably.
Yeah.
I think there's perhaps another word which I think people might find a useful for you just to explain, if you wouldn't mind, Anne, which is this
Okay.
concept of intersectionality.
Yeah, of course. So intersectionality, the way I look at it is, it's just a recognition that every single person has multiple identities, and all of those identities are going to shape who they are and what they need. And so, as an example, I am a queer, non-binary white person, and with just those three identities, obviously I have many other identities, but just with those three identities, I have privilege and I have areas in which I've been marginalized. And so, as a queer and a non binary person, especially in the service, I was frequently passed over for promotions, and um, I had a much, much harder time because I was openly queer and non binary. And, the flip side of that is, as a white person, I also had a lot of privilege because of that identity. I grew up in a rural southeast Texas,
Hmm.
and their race mattered to
Yeah.
people, and so I had more opportunities than other people did. And so it's a recognition that everyone has multiple identities, and they're all going to impact who they are, and how they are and what they need in different ways. And intersectionality is just acknowledging that
Hmm.
and working with that.
Okay. Oh, thank you for that. So if we're looking to advance equity within an organisation, is this something that can be done bottom up? And by that I mean, we see a lot of organisations setting up employer networks, employer social networks,
Mm.
networks for those different facets that you've just been talking about, those different elements. We see that happening. So can it therefore be a ground up sort of groundswell that can make equity um, progress within an organisation, or does it need leadership direction?
Yeah. Well, my approach to this is absolutely, it can create change from the bottom up, but you absolutely have to have that leadership support. And so for me, it's a holistic perspective where you not only have to have the leadership support at the top, you need to have the input from the bottom, and you also need to have all of the middle managers engaging in all of that multi-way communication. And so, everything that I do with leaders, I always tell them that they need to have employee groups that they're reaching out to on all of the different topics, because, leaders think they need to know everything these days. And the reality is that no one can know everything. And so we have to have groups or communities of people who are going to help us grow as a leader. And so I always advise that they have kind of grassroots, employee led groups that are focusing specifically on the different topics that they need as an organization.
And right, so yes, I mean, it's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the line managers and team leaders and people managers in the middle, because they're always so crucial, aren't they, to what goes on in a more localized way. So your leadership is setting out the stall and painting the picture of the direction, and allowing almost, and endorsing and role
Mhm.
modeling
Yes.
this kind of thinking. Um, and we need to make sure that that is equally applied by managers, in order to enable people to take on board the
Mhm.
opportunities and the initiatives that perhaps an organisation is putting in place. So how,
Yeah.
when you're trying to persuade leadership, let's just talk about them for a minute. Um, if we're trying to persuade leadership as to why this stuff matters, what's your take on it, Ang? Do you go in on the basis of, well, this is the right thing to do and here's why? Or do you go in on the basis of, well, actually, this makes good business sense? Or or might it be a little bit of both?
Yeah. I definitely say that I tend towards the little bit of both, but I almost always frame it in a leadership perspective. And so my background and my education is in social work, human relations and organization development, and leadership.
Hmm.
And so when I talk about leadership, I talk about it as a functioning machine, and the person at the top who is kind of guiding that or leading that organization is going to have full control over what happens, and they're going to need to hold people accountable. They're going to need to mentor and guide. They're going to
Hmm.
need to get input from everyone around them. And so I definitely think that it is both directions. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a
No,
moment,
no, that's okay.
but
Right. And is there business evidence, kind of
yeah.
commercials, key performance indicators that you can sort of say, oh, yes, well, if you do this, you will see improved productivity, or you will see improved staff retention or talent
Yeah.
attraction, for example?
Yeah. I definitely tend to focus on the people centered approach. And
Hmm.
so, some of the first things that I work with leaders on is helping them to understand a cycle of reflexivity, which is just developing their self awareness, their self evaluation, and their self adjustment practices,
Hmm.
and bringing intentionality and congruence to that process so that they can learn how to learn what they
Okay.
need to know and how they need to change. And then uh, after practicing implementing the ways that they are have changed, did that do what they needed it to do? And so when I talk with them in the beginning, it is about helping them to understand that they need to have this cycle first and foremost to be able to help them engage in their interpersonal skills with the people that they need to do that. And so when you talk about KPIs, I like to definitely start with a human centered approach,
Hmm.
and figure out individually what are the areas that the leader needs to work on. And I have something called a leadership wheel. It's very similar to a life wheel, where leaders kind of self rank themselves on the different areas, and we cover things like emotional intelligence, body intelligence, mindfulness, like different areas that leaders need to be able to implement these things. And we start with that because even if they do know and understand that equity is important, the biggest area that I see leaders fail in is not knowing how to practically apply some of the information, and not knowing how to engage appropriately with the individuals on their teams. And so it's about helping them to really dive in and develop their interpersonal skills and their own consciousness to be able to navigate conflict as it arises.
So, do you? I know you obviously, part of what your practice is coaching. So, what you've just been talking about, does that tend to be in a kind of one-to-one situation, or would you begin with a leadership team and
Yeah.
then yeah?
I have two different approaches. I do work one on one with individuals or leaders, but
Hmm.
I prefer to work with the entire leadership team. And so we call them masterminds, but we have masterminds where the leadership team can come together. They can get the education on some of the areas that they need to be educated on in terms of equity and equity based practices. They
Hmm.
get the coaching sessions, and they get a community of practice. And so we teach them how to engage as a group of leaders in their organization to reflect on what's going well, what isn't going well, and what are the areas that each leader needs to develop, and how is that going for them. And so helping them to engage with each other so that long after I am gone, they know how to ask each other the questions, they know how to develop the other leaders on their team, and those kinds of things. Because at the end of the day, for me, what's most important is that they, as a leadership team, are teaching the other leaders in their organization, and that kind of ripples out to the entire organization.
Right. Right. Now, you used a word that I have to confess to not being familiar with, so I'm going to ask you if you can explain what you meant by that.
Okay.
You used the word reflexivity, and
Hmm.
I'm being a bit dim because I really don't know what that is.
No, it's my fault. It's really big in academia, and really it came from researchers trying to acknowledge that uh, they have an impact on whatever it is that they're studying, and wanting to be really aware of the biases that they have, and do everything that they can to prevent those biases from impacting their research.
Ah.
So what reflexivity is, it's just recognizing that we all have biases,
Hmm.
and taking steps to actively address those. And
Hmm.
so when I talk to leaders about reflexivity, I tell them it's three simple steps: self-awareness, self-evaluation, and self-adjustment. And so if I become aware that I have a bias, I acknowledge that bias, and then I say, how can I improve this? So I ask for evaluative criteria from other people in my life. Maybe I take a self-assessment. Maybe I do something else,
Hmm.
and then I say, okay, I have this bias. I need to make some adjustments in these areas, and then I actually make those adjustments, and then I go back through that cycle to say, did the adjustments that I make prevent me from um, bringing that bias back into my life? And if it didn't, then I go through the process again. And if it did, then continuously learn and grow in other ways.
Right. Got you. Makes sense. So, we've got just over 5 minutes to go. And I'd like to just conclude really on two things, Ang. First
Okay.
of all, this can all seem a bit enormous sometimes, can't it? And oh my goodness, where do we start? Um, and if an organization or somebody listening to this show now in a leadership role thinks, actually, this is important, but I really don't quite know where to begin. What would your advice be to listeners who feel that, this is something they want to work towards, but they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by what the complexity of it looks like?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's fair to acknowledge that this is an incredibly complex topic,
Yeah.
and in different places, with different people, everyone has a different understanding of what it is, and it plays out differently in all different kinds of environments. And so, I think we would not be doing ourselves justice if we didn't acknowledge that.
Hmm.
And so I would say first, just start with a self awareness of this is a complex topic, and I need to know and understand at a minimum what my own biases are, how they impact my leadership approach, and how I might be able to make some changes to be a better leader. And the second thing I would say is focus on small, sustainable habits that you can integrate into your daily routines. And so, one of the big things that I talk with leaders about is it can really be as simple as having a checklist on your desk that asks yourself, simple questions. Did I recognize my employees today? Did I acknowledge their contributions? Did I
Hmm.
celebrate the specific or the unique holidays that were happening in this week? And those kinds of things. And so focus on small, sustainable changes that have a big impact. And of course, you can go deep into that too and say, how are our processes in terms of hiring and promotions and team dynamics and those kinds of things. But start small and work your way up.
Hmm. Good advice. Good advice. Lovely. It's interesting actually. We at Engage for Success run an annual employee engagement survey and index of the UK workforce. We're just about to publish our third third consecutive year report. And one of the things that we've looked at specifically
I think I
this year,
lost you.
which we hadn't looked at before, was the impact of neurodiverge neurodivergence on employee engagement. And what we haven't published the results yet, but they're coming out in the next couple of weeks. But I've seen a little bit of a taster of it, and certainly what it seems to be suggesting is that employees who are neurodivergent are demonstrating lower levels of employee engagement
Hmm.
in their organisation, which does rather suggest, and we would not be surprised by this, I think, that there is definitely work to be done.
I absolutely agree with that. I can't even tell you the number of individuals that I have engaged with, both as leaders and as employees, with one side not understanding the other in terms of, leadership and mentoring,
Mm,
or even just supervising individuals who are neurodivergent and not understanding some of their needs in that process, and helping
mm,
the leaders to understand, if you are working with someone who's neurodivergent, you've got to work with them and ask, what are your needs? How can I support you in that? Instead of getting frustrated when, it's not going the way that they want. And then, also understanding if they've got specific, visual needs or like office setup needs, like working
mm,
with them in that process.
mm.
And so wholeheartedly, I would love to see that, but I also think that this is going to be one of the biggest topics that we start to focus in on in the future for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the research comes out is published at the end of April, and we've got a live online event on the April the 11th, which we're going to be announcing over the next few days. So look out for that, and anyone listening at engageforsuccess.org. So we've literally got 1 minute left, which leaves really no time at all. But I think it would be a disservice if we don't touch on this briefly.
Okay.
What do you see the future looking like? Because we know that there are challenges to this kind of thinking that are really quite loud, and starting to gain some traction, particularly in the US. So, what's the future look like, Ang? Are you positive?
Yeah.
And if so, what gives you pause for that positivity.
Yeah. Well, I definitely choose to maintain a positive outlook. And I think that most people understand that the future of work is going to require adaptability. It's going to require a much more shared power structure and a shift from some of the older leadership styles that we saw, which were very strict. And so I think we're going to need to have more inclusive decision making. We're going to need to have more collaborative environments, and we're absolutely going to have to integrate equity into our leadership development in order to be able to navigate some of the complexities like retention and engagement in the workplace.
Yes, and I absolutely think you're entirely right. We've literally run out of time. So, Aang Lakey, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for taking us through the topic of equity as the foundation for a thriving workplace. Thank you to our listeners for listening to Engage for Success Radio. And don't forget, you can download or stream any of the great shows from our archive at any time. Just visit engageforsuccess.org. That's where you can also get involved in the movement, where you can get in touch, and where you can sign up for our newsletter and also keep up to date on events and research and case studies in our blog. So thank you for listening. Find out more at engageforsuccess.org. And thank you to today's guest, Aang Lakey. Thank you and goodbye.
Engage for Success Radio, raising the profile of employee engagement and shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.